Some people say architects are the handmaidens of climate change because they are passively executing the wills of big bad developers.
40% of global emissions are linked in some way to the built environment. So it's absolutely essential that we take urban planning and architecture seriously when it comes to fighting the climate emergency.
Why are we continuing to make the mistakes that we've made previously? We should be moving forwards now. And that is where government really has to be bold, because the longer they hold off, the less the public benefit.
Concrete is one of the worst culprits in the climate crisis. It's responsible for about 8% of CO2 emissions around the world.
In the midst of a growing climate crisis, construction is one of the few industries that hasn't sketched a path to net zero. The UN has warned that energy use in the sector is at an all-time high, and the volatility of oil and gas prices is hampering investment in decarbonisation by governments, households, and business. I've come to the Netherlands to look at its pioneering development of green buildings. One example in the port city of Rotterdam is Sarà, a state-of-the-art apartment project. Although it's yet to be built, the developers are hoping to demonstrate that sustainable construction can both make money and meet the country's acute need for housing.
It's a wooden residential project, 50 meters high. As a developer, we want to make sure that we contain CO2 instead of emitting CO2.
So what happens to all those trees that you chop down, though? You're still removing a carbon sink.
Yeah, but the trees grow back. That's the good thing about trees. If you use concrete, it's not growing back.
So you plant some trees for every tree that you chop down?
Every tree we use for Sarà, or 4 trees are being planted back.
The architects say that the 17-story apartment block, made from sustainable timber instead of concrete, will be carbon negative. Half the 100 flats will be affordable rental homes for Rotterdam's middle-income residents and key workers, like teachers and police officers. For Mark, getting away from the construction industry's business as usual has been a challenge.
We are more like social developers. We develop not for shareholders' value, but for shared values. We also make profit. It can be much less profit than the bigger traditional companies. In the beginning, people were a little bit skeptic. You cannot build input. You cannot combine that with mid-rental apartment. You cannot combine that with the biodiversity. You have to make choices. We say we don't make choices. We do it all.
Sarà isn't due to be ready until late 2024. But one landmark Dutch experiment that's already open for business is Matrix 1, a prime example of the Dutch government's so-called circular construction strategy. As and when needed, it can be reconfigured, and 90% of the building's materials can be redeployed. This cluster of sustainability tech startups and laboratories sits at the heart of Amsterdam University's Science Park. The idea is to foster cross-pollination between researchers and entrepreneurs.
So it's a modular system. So if a laboratory changes into an office or vice versa, you can easily adapt to it.
It's like a big Lego.
And that also goes for the whole felt. You can easily remove it and reuse it in another building. For example, the concrete floors are actually on top of the steel, and there are loose elements so that you can really take them out and reuse them in the new building.
Every component used in the building has been logged in an online database with a digital twin or virtual representation of each item used.
A lot of people who work in the field of circularity are thinking of buildings just as temporary material storage. What you see here also, this is a large material bank. Every screw, every mullion, everything you find here has a digital twin.
Let's talk about cost, though.
Yeah.
Is it still more expensive to build this way than in traditional ways?
It is changing. Timber structure is still more expensive. But if you look at the construction time, there the client can save with prefabrication, and that saves a lot of costs.
Despite recent turmoil in Dutch politics, EU rules, which are binding on all member states, provide a framework for progress.
We have new build standards in the Netherlands now that I would put in the top handful of European countries in terms of their insulation and their airtightness standards. Since 2018, the Dutch government has effectively banned connection to the gas grid for new homes and new buildings. It's incredibly important to have all the incentives pointing in the right direction.
Cheaper lending can also spur more sustainable developers.
Finance partners can accelerate sustainable developments, investing in sustainable buildings when they give a reduction in, for instance, for 5 or 10 basis points when you invest in a sustainable building and when you meet certain sustainable criteria on your development.
Despite some progress with greener construction, the Netherlands is still grappling with a housing shortage. A similar lack of new homes in the UK is being made worse by political flip-flopping and regulatory uncertainty.
We need more government clarity, so clear targets, clear policies and regulations to underpin them, to provide this confidence that actually the UK is the right place to invest. I work with a lot of European insulation manufacturers. They find it very difficult to make the case for investment in the UK because there is a lack of policy certainty.
While high energy prices triggered by Russia's war on Ukraine have highlighted the need for more sustainable supplies, an anti-ESG backlash has gained traction in the US and the UK.
Every industry will always tell you it's not the right time. And that, for me, is where politicians need to be braver. Because if we are building old-fashioned buildings with not enough insulation and not any smart technologies in them, essentially we're condemning the people who are going to live in those homes to high bills going forwards and high carbon.
Concerns about global warming, together with the constraints on new housing, have highlighted the need to adapt existing buildings rather than tear them down.
What if we change the goals? Not to be spectacular, not to be the tallest, not to be the shiniest, but to be the most ecological, to be the most sustainable, to be the most affordable? What if we stop building from a place of unlimited abundance and started to build from the reality, which is that resources are limited?
The coming decades are set to bring the largest wave of urban growth in human history, which means that new construction is unavoidable.
Architecture is the infrastructure on which culture happens. It is the armature of society. We're trying to live in symbiosis with nature rather than as antagonists. If we want to make that change culturally, we need to make that change in our architecture as well.
Back in Rotterdam,
If you look at the next projects, it's going to be more easy because we were like a startup and now we are more like a scale up. We have the system is ready. We can scale that up. We can reproduce it and make more sawas in other locations with lower cost.
the challenge for Sawa is to set an example that's impossible for mainstream developers and investors to resist.
It's like a big container ship that has to turn around, and that's not easy. That's the reason why you need startups, nice developers, or other parties who change the world.